Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. So this is a unique series, obviously. It's an exciting one. Fun to do research for too. I learned a lot of new things. So here's how this is going to, how we're going to lay this out. Today, we're going to be looking at the Halachic theory and understanding of how women were looked at in terms of Torah learning. So today's theoretical exercise and looking at like the different sources about what the halacha and what Torah itself says about women learning, and we'll see how that understanding changed over time, and that will give us kind of context for the history that we'll learn and we'll understand two things. First, we'll understand how we got till today where women are all learning Torah on all levels, and we'll also understand how unique it was that there were some women, even when it wasn't common, who were actually involved in Torah scholarship. We're really going to appreciate the uniqueness of those women when we understand the halachic thinking behind it. Yeah, that's how we're going to do it. And then God willing, it'll give us context for the next 4 weeks later when we get through the actual biographies of the different women who were involved in Torah learning. So we're going to start from the end and then go back to the beginning. Start with the end as in like where we are today, and then we're going to run into a conversation between the Rebbe and like the Lubavitcher Rebbe, our Rebbe, and the Belzer Rebbe, a conversation they had about women learning, and you'll kind of see a bit of the split in thinking, and then we'll take us back to the beginning and understand what's behind their split. What are the history behind their split? And actually, we'll make some references to the first series we did, when we did like the history of halacha, and you'll kind of see a little bit how certain regions take on different thinkings, which is an interesting thing itself. Okay, so that's why I called it from the end back to the beginning. We're going to start from the end where we are today, and then we'll go back to the beginning to see how we got here. Okay, so women, where we are now, women as activists. So these are, of course, pictures. The middle picture is a picture of the Kinnis HaShluchos happening this Shabbos in New York, the Women Chabad Convention, with thousands of women all over the world. So women as community leaders is obviously widespread, normal, something we think about as just regular, and which I guess is apropos that we're doing this series now, as well as the fact that this past week, Haftarah was about Devorah, who will be our first biography next week. Devorah, the first woman that we know of who was involved in Torah learning and scholarship. And one of the times that my father and uncle, Rabbi Nu and Itchy, went to the Rebbe with Marvin Chinkowski, there's a video of gem of this, where they went by the Rebbe for a bracha, and Chinkowski, I think, talks about their daughter, and the Rebbe comments on the fact that their daughter's name is Devorah, and she could sing. It's a nice little video, so it kind of all ties in. Anyway, on the left and on the right are pictures of public gatherings that the Rebbe held for women, which is something that's very unusual if you think of Hasidic history and Hasidim being like a, quote, men's club, that the Rebbe would have a public gathering that's just for women. It's a few times a year, at least twice a year. They were referred to them as Farbrengens, actually. Besides for the public gathering for women, at almost every public Farbrengen that wasn't, let's say, on Shabbos, it was a weekday Farbrengen, so there was a larger crowd, which meant there was a women's section and women there. At least one talk was dedicated to the role of women and addressing women, which leads to understanding the following interesting little story. The story goes that there was a woman, I believe her name was Mrs. Pinson, who told the Rebbe the following. She was in a private audience with the Rebbe, and she tells the Rebbe the following. To understand the nuance of the entire story is not so important, but the main point I think you'll get. She tells the Rebbe like this. The Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe of Chabad, he turned Torah scholars into Hasidim, Go'onim. He turned Torah scholars into Hasidim. The second Rebbe of Chabad turned younger light into Hasidim, meaning he turned Kollel people, young guys who were spending their time studying Torah. He turned them into Hasidim. The Tzemach Tzedek, the third Chabad Rebbe, turned Rabbanim, rabbinic leaders, into Hasidim. The fourth Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Shmuel, he turned Balabatim, business people, into Hasidim. The sixth Chabad Rebbe, the Rabbi Rashab, Rabbi Shalom Daber, he turned Bachrim, young students, into Hasidim. The previous Rebbe turned kids into Hasidim, and then she concludes telling Rebbe, and you turned women into Hasidim. And Rebbe was very proud and happy to hear that statement. And this is Rebbe was the first one to do this, the whole public gathering just for women. And the two pictures on the right and the left are from those gatherings. At the end, when Rebbe would when the women would file by and give Rebbe their requests or their letters or whatnot, and Rebbe would engage with each one. You kind of see the picture on the right, a rare picture of the Rebbe wearing his reading glasses in conversation with a woman about something or other. So this is where we are today in terms of women being engaged in Jewish life. It's pretty much normal. This here is a letter in which the Rebbe writes to, you can read the Hebrew if you want, but I want to highlight two things here. The first thing is, note the date on the top right. It's a letter. It's written in the 24th of Sivan, Tafshin Yud Aleph. That would be 1951. This is less than 6 months that the Rebbe becomes Rebbe. He becomes Rebbe in Yud Shvat. On the 10th of Shvat, 1951, he assumes the role of Rebbe. And now you're Shvat, so that's Adar, Nisan, Iyar, Sivan. That's 4 months later. I don't think there was 2 Adars that year. So it's 4 months later, less than a half a year later. So you can say it's one of the Rebbe's first acts in assuming the leadership of Rebbe. He writes a letter to what's called Vad HaPoyel Shel Agudus Chasidei Chabad Ba'eretz HaKodesh. That is the active body of Hasidic leadership in Israel. He writes a letter, and he begins, the opening of the letter is, I received your letter from the 21st of Iyar. For whatever reason, my response has been delayed. My apologies. It's Iyar, it's till Sivan, it's a month later. And then he gives them points of suggestions and things that they should do. And point number 3 is, Ladaiti, in my opinion, it is important that Agudus Chasidei Chabad, the organized Chabad institution, should have a unique division for women. And my intention here is twofold. First of all, that women who are Chasidei Chabad, who are connected to Chabad, should come as a group. And number 2, they should be active amongst other women in general. And obviously, in their unique way, with their unique role as women, they should have their own division. It's one of his first acts as Rebbe, to institute Neshei Chabad in Israel and then Neshei Chabad in America, to officially make an organized body of women. It's funny, if you see the little first couple letters back and forth. So at the beginning, the guy who receives the letter gets active right away, and at some point Rebbe says, well, actually, I want them to have their own leaders, not you. Like, let the women be leaders in charge of the women's division. I mean, the guy was doing what Rebbe told him, right? So he was becoming like the leader of the women's division, and Rebbe tells him, like, the women should organize that division. Like, thank you very much for setting it up. Now let them run the show. It shouldn't be like a guy who's running the women's division. Within a matter of like 2 months, you see, if you go through this volume, you can see the letters. You don't see the letters that the Rebbe receives from them, but you see the letters the Rebbe sends to them, and you can kind of see how the Rebbe guides them, and what they should be doing, what their activity should be, and so on. So this is very early on in the Rebbe's leadership, and this is before the feminist women's rights movement. They were like preempted this with like getting women engaged in Jewish Hasidic life way at the beginning of his leadership, 1951, right from the beginning. I've heard it said, this is not a verified story, but I've heard it said that the famous chassid Rabbi Peretz Mochkin, who lived here in Montreal, Rabbi Mochkin, the head of the Chabad in Montreal, his father. So his father was asked, as a follower of the previous Rebbe, like, what do you think of the young new Rebbe, who was significantly younger than him? And he said, look, I can tell you one thing. The women's section is more full than it ever was, so clearly he's doing something right. This was his remark. In other words, he was someone who lived the old world and the new world, and he could see the change. The women's section is filling up. Okay, so that's as far as women activism. Now here comes in terms of women studying Torah. So here are pictures of 3 schools. The left is Beis Rivka in Crown Heights, the Lubavitch Girls' School. The middle is a random Beis Yaakov that Google shared with me. And on the right is what's most interesting. So you'll notice I'm putting pictures of what you would call right-wing Orthodox communities. In other words, the point I'm making is that it's not like, it's mainstream Orthodoxy that has girls' schools to learn Torah. Starting with Lubavitch, Beis Yaakov, and then all the way on the right is Beis Malka of Belz. Now here's the interesting thing. It's hard to see, I'm not sure if you can see in the picture, but in the Hebrew it says, Merkaz Chinuchi Labanos, it's an educational institution for girls, called Beis Malka, and then it says, Benesius Harabbanit Mibel Zashtalita, under the leadership of the Rabbanit, the Rebbetzin of Belz. Now, I did a little Googling, and I found earlier stationery of Beis Malka in which it says, under the leadership of the Rebbe. But this building says, under the leadership of the Rebbetzin. So, sometime between its founding and today, the leadership has gone to the Rebbetzin. So even in a community like Belz, which is ultra-Orthodox community, has not just a girls' school, but a girls' school run by the leadership of the Rebbetzin, who is pictured right here on the right, who's a strong personality, very well known. You can Google her. You'll find videos of her leading gatherings and teaching and Fabrengens and whatnot. She's a strong woman, and she's at the head of this school. Now this, so this is where we are today, girls learning Torah. What they're learning, we'll kind of talk about that soon. What exactly are they learning in these schools? And what do we mean when we say they're learning Torah? But this brings us to the next slide. So that was a picture of the Belz Rebbetzin, who is leading this school as like a Rebbetzin, not like as a Rebbe's wife. She's leading it as a Rebbetzin herself. She's rather well known in the Hasidic world as sort of leading, not just being a wife of a Rebbe. This is her husband, pictured. This is the Belz Rebbe, sitting in a private conversation with the Rebbe. Public-private, in the sense that it's a one-on-one conversation, but there's people gathered around listening and recording the two Rebbes speak, the Rebbe and the Belz Rebbe. Now, at some point, the conversation goes to the question of educating girls. This is why it's kind of, to see this little change is interesting. You see here, you'll see how the Belz Rebbe talks to the Rebbe about girls learning, and then fast forward, this is 1981, fast forward, what are we, 50 years later, right? Almost 40 years later, and his wife is running the girls' school. So just interesting to see. So I'm translating English, but you can read the Hebrew. The Belz Rebbe says, is it in the Rebbe's opinion that girls should be learning Mishnayos and Gemara? Meaning, should they be learning not necessarily limited to the halachas that are relevant to them, to their observance, but should they be learning just general Torah knowledge, Mishnayos, Gemara, Talmud as a whole? And so the Rebbe responds, well, first of all, the Mishnayos, that component of Talmud, is halachas, so that for sure. If so, women should definitely be reading that. As far as Gemara, which is like the analysis of the halacha, it's not just straight do, don't, so it's beyond what they need for observance, says the Rebbe, when they asked me about this, the Rebbe is telling this to the Belz Rebbe. I responded that they should learn the background, the Gemara, relevant to the halachas they're learning. So, if they're learning the laws of Shabbos, the Rebbe gives the example, then they should learn the tractate Shabbos, which gives the background to the law. In other words, as we'll see soon, there's this idea that girls should learn the halachas that are relevant to them, and if that's the case, just teach them dry halacha. What else do they need to know? To which the Rebbe says, when people ask me about this, I told them, no, don't just give them the dry halacha, give them the whole background Gemara. That's half the Gemara. Half of Talmud is relevant to back analysis to laws relevant to women, because all the prohibitions are in there. So that's all the laws of kosher, all the laws of family purity, all the laws of Shabbos, Yom Tif. So what are we taking out? Tefillin, Talis. It's not that many halachas. You just threw most of the Gemara right back in to what women should be learning. And the Rebbe continues. I said even more than this. Not just that they should learn the background of the laws relevant to them, but I said today, if you don't teach the girls Gemara, it's not the result won't be that they won't learn it. On the contrary, they will end up learning the Gemara, but you don't know which books they'll be learning it from, who their teachers will be. Rebbe continues. Our generation is not like the previous generations, where a girl would learn from her house, and everything that she needed to know, she asked from her mother or her father. We live in an open generation. A girl will ask of her friend, what do you guys do? And that's how she'll follow. She'll go to shul, she'll meet other girls, and she's curious, what are you guys learning? And then when this girl hears that there's something called a Gemara that gives explanation to what she is learning, when she wasn't giving an explanation, I don't believe that she's just going to say, well, I don't need to know the answer. If she hears in shul that there's an explanation for what she's learning, she's going to go seek it out. But we won't know, again, which books and sources she'll use. So in other words, if we don't educate her with a backstory, she'll educate herself, and now you're running the risk of complete misunderstanding of everything. So not only is it okay, I think they actually should. This is what the Rebbe is telling the Belzer Rebbe. Now here comes the part which will take us back to the beginning. Right? So far we just have like a sort of like a discussion on traditionalism versus like, open thinking, forward thinking. The Rebbe is kind of forward thinking, looking at the realities on the ground. We're not stopping people from getting educated. They're all going to get educated, and we can do one of two things: either make believe they're not getting educated, or actually get in the forefront and educate them before they get educated incorrectly, which is basically what the Rebbe is telling him. So the Belzer Rebbe pushes back and says, if so, what is considered, quote, teaching her tiflus? This is a line from the Gemara, which we'll get to in a minute, where the Gemara implies or states that teaching a girl Gemara has negative consequences. And the word the Gemara uses is tiflus. This is the word the Gemara uses, I'm sure you heard it. This is the word the Gemara uses to describe the negative impact of teaching girls Torah. Okay, so the Gemara says tiflus, and Rashi translates this as armumius. But there's other translations to that. Yeah. We'll get that in a second. But so the Gemara says that teaching girl Torah is like teaching her tiflus, a negative connotation. So he asks the Rebbe, like, okay, you're saying that the girl should learn everything, so what did the Gemara mean when it said that it's not good because it's tiflus? To which the Rebbe says, well, first of all, if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, you'll see that tiflus is only on certain parts of Torah. The Shulchan Aruch itself separates between the written text versus the oral tradition, so there's already a difference there. And then the Rebbe adds, my point is that nowadays, the tiflus already exists before you've taught them anything. And when you teach them Torah, you'll actually undo the tiflus. So the negative consequence you're trying to avoid by not teaching them Torah, they're actually getting that because you're not teaching them Torah. And if you taught them Torah, it'll straighten them out. This is the gist of the conversation. So now, this is like the end, like we're back to where we are today. Like there's this tension about the Rebbe thinking forward. And again, you see that his wife today now runs this girls' school. I don't know to what degree they learn Gemara in that school. Maybe we'll get to that soon. I mean, I'm not familiar with the curriculum, but we'll kind of see what they're doing. But you can see they're arguing over what the Gemara means. Where the Belzer Rebbe is understanding it in the classic traditional understanding, which is, if you teach them Gemara, it's going to have negative consequence. And the Rebbe is saying, other way around. You don't, that'll have negative consequence. So you better teach them. So let's understand what they're talking about. Let's go back to the Gemara, see what the Gemara says, see how it was understood throughout the generations, and then we'll have a better understanding of, first of all, how forward-thinking the Rebbe was in regard to this, and how evolutionary in some ways the Rebbe's thinking is. Okay, so let's begin then. So we're at the end, now we're back to the beginning. So here's the Gemara that he's referring to. This comes from Talmud Sota. The laws of Sota, or the tractate of Sota, discusses a unique set of laws, which is a scenario in which a married woman is suspect of infidelity. So there are no witnesses to verify what happened, but there's a suspicion. So she's taken to the temple, and a whole procedure that she goes through. And the end of the procedure is she drinks this potion that's made in the temple, and that potion kind of tells us whether she's innocent or guilty. If she's innocent, she lives. If she's guilty, she dies rather, what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry?
Unceremoniously.
Rather ceremoniously, actually. It's not very, it's not a very pleasant death, shall we say. So the Gemara says like this, sorry? Yeah, it's, last year I taught this tractate in the morning, and the entire tractate is translated and on YouTube. You can have all my classes are there for the whole last 2 years. I don't know. Sorry?
I said I'm not sure I want to see it.
Maybe. At any rate, so here the Gemara says like this: if she has a merit, if the woman who's suspect has a merit, so even if she's guilty, it delays her punishment. It delays punishment for her, and she does not die immediately. There is a merit that delays punishment for 1 year. There's a larger merit that delays punishment for 2 years. And there's a merit that delays punishment for 3 years, even if she's guilty. From here, Ben Azai states, a person is obligated to teach his daughter Torah, so that if she drinks and she does not die immediately, she will know that some merit she has delayed punishment for her. So the Mishnah doesn't say what the merit she has is, but the Mishnah is saying like this. A person knows, or I guess women at large know, that this drink, it's kind of like a whole thing. There's a whole talk in town. There's a woman being dragged to the temple, and she's exposed a little bit. It's not like such a pretty sight, and people are talking about it, and she's drinking everything to see what's going to happen, and she lives 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and people walk around saying, this whole Satan thing is not true. And little do they know, this woman has some merit, and that's why she's not dead yet, right? So therefore, Ben Azai says, if your girls know Torah, they'll understand the system, they'll understand how it works, and they're not going to throw this whole system, this whole thing out the window because the consequence didn't happen. Well, they'll know she has a merit. That's what Ben Azai is saying. Okay, so is this Ben Azai's really, this is his source for why girls should learn Torah? Maybe, or maybe he just thinks in general women should learn Torah, and this is kind of an indication, you see? It's not as if he says like, from here Ben Azai says, it's like Ben Azai's pointing to this and saying, you see, it's important that they know what's going on, because they're part of the process. If they're not part, they don't know, they can be left in the dark. That's kind of what Ben Azai is saying, meaning if I'm taking his words and extrapolating it beyond just the laws of Saita, what he's saying is, women are part of the process of observing Torah. And unless they understand, they're going to be completely misled. So teach your daughters Torah, obligated to do so. This is Ben Azai's position. It should be noted that Ben Azai, elsewhere in the Gemara, is he is the model of someone who actually said, I'm not interested in getting married because my love is Torah, and the world will go on without me. This is what the Gemara says about Ben Azai. There's a different version to the story that he ended up at least being engaged to Rabbi Akiva's daughter, but the marriage didn't really, never came to fruition. But that's him. Ben Azai was a very strong, all of life is Torah, there's nothing else to it but Torah. So for him, women should learn Torah also. Right? Okay. But now comes the other opinion. Rabbi Eliezer says, anyone who teaches his daughter Torah is teaching her, they translate it here as promiscuity, that word tiflut, or tiflus in the Ashkenazi pronunciation. So this is what the Belzer Rebbe was talking about. Citing this Gemara, where Rabbi Eliezer says, if you're teaching your daughter Torah, it's like you're teaching her tiflus. What are you doing with this, Rabbi Lubavitch Rebbe? You're teaching girls Torah, you're teaching them tiflus. Why promiscuity? Well, that's a good question. There are actually two interpretations to what the word tiflus means. The translation they give here, which is promiscuity, is from Rashi. And Rashi basically says, in commenting on the Gemara, on this Mishnah, that you give a woman too much cunning, too much cleverness, shrewdness, she'll use it, she'll misappropriate it. And it'll end up who knows where. Might lead to mixed dancing, as they say. The other translation, as Rambam puts it, is tiflus, as in she'll misinterpret it because she doesn't have the requisite background knowledge and proper education, so if she teach her a little Torah, she'll misunderstand it and misinterpret it. So there's two versions as to what exactly tiflus means. At any rate, this is the Gemara is referring to. But at least we see now, it's not cut and dry that the Gemara makes an announcement, no one should teach their daughters Torah. There's a dispute, number one. There's a view which says you're actually obligated to do so. That's number one. And number two, and this is the main point, right? The Rebbe says, in my opinion, if you don't teach them, they're getting tiflus. Right? In other words, if you don't teach them Torah, they're going to have promiscuity, not the other way around. That's kind of what the Rebbe is saying, right? Which means, okay, well, let's see. We'll see that in a second. Okay, that's a good question. But does he mean only in the Sota time? Maybe. We'll see in a second. We'll see in a second what he just said, yeah. There's one opinion which says one should teach their daughters Torah, and the other view which says no. And the one who says no doesn't just say no as in like without any background, gives a reason for it, for the problem of tiflus. And what we're going to see is, first of all, there's going to be those who substantiate the view of Ben Azai, and even those who are of the view of Rabbi Eliezer that it's as if you're teaching tiflus, will always think about, well, is it actually going to be tiflus for this girl? And if it isn't, maybe we should let her. That's basically what's going to come out from what we're going to learn. This is the trajectory. Okay, so I'm going to make a statement now which is probably not true, but you'll see why I'm saying it. As far as this text that we have here, which I actually should say that I got a lot of these texts collected from Rabbi Dinnerman, my brother's rabbi in New York. Rabbi Dinnerman, he did a class on this and I asked him for his notes, so a lot of it comes from there. But it's just interesting that there's a little bit of an Ashkenazi and Sephardic split here. We'll see. So first is Rambam. Rambam writes, it's in English there, so I'll read it quickly. A woman who studies Torah will receive reward. He doesn't begin by saying a woman shouldn't learn Torah or it's useless. A woman who studies Torah will receive reward. However, that reward will not be as great as a man's, since she was not commanded in this mitzvah. Whoever performs a deed which he is not commanded to do does not receive as great a reward as the one who performs the mitzvah that he is commanded to do. So what do we have so far? She can go ahead and learn, no problem. She'll get rewarded even. Not the same level because she wasn't commanded. Okay, fine. Then it continues. Even though she will receive reward, the sages commanded that a person should not teach his daughter Torah, because most women, I'm quoting, cannot concentrate their attention on study and thus transform the words of Torah into idle matters because of the lack of understanding. That's how he understands tiflus.
So basically they're saying that women are stupid.
Yeah.
1 second. So what did he say? He said women can learn Torah, but then he said you shouldn't teach your daughters Torah. So what is that? How do you drive those two?
Of their lack of understanding.
Right, but how do you drive the two statements? Don't teach your daughters, but women can. Which means, as a rule, don't teach your daughters. If it so happens your daughter grows up and she knows how to learn Torah,
Right.
good for her. That's what it seems like, right? So even though he's taking Ben Azai's position, he's taking Eliezer's position, which is teaching your daughters Torah is like teaching them tiflus, which he translates as lack of understanding. That's not a bar on all women learning Torah. It's a recommendation for you or a command for you, the father, not to teach your daughter's Torah. Because she's probably part of the rule who's not going to understand it. But if it so happens that there's a woman who's an exception to the rule and she learns, gets reward. Right? So even if you're taking Eliezer's position, it's a command to the father not to teach the daughter, not a prohibition against women from learning. That's the first thing, right?
Could it be that she did learn and then she leaves her father?
Meaning when she gets older and she proves to be the exception to the rule, where she actually is not misunderstanding and she's getting it right, okay. That's what it seems like.
You don't know.
Sorry?
Yeah, but she could not be the exception to the rule.
She could.
And she can still learn.
She could. Historically speaking, that wasn't the norm, right?
Also, what would hold
Historically
her
speaking, that wasn't the norm.
attracted to
So again, you see, sorry?
How would she be attracted to learning Torah?
Well, like I said at the beginning of the class, what we're going to get here is how brave it was, or how like out of the ordinary it was for the women who did become scholars. Because this was the thinking. Like, your daughter probably is not going to be able to learn, so don't waste time teaching her. That's what I'm saying. But if she grows up and does, whatever, okay, she's going to get reward, not as much as a man, but that's good. That's kind of the way it's
I
being.
think in a way.
Sorry? Yeah.
It's because she was not commanded.
It's greater.
Thing.
Okay.
You know,
I was hoping no one would ask that, because there is a source which says that when someone's not commanded, it's even greater. And how you reconcile that statement with this statement is a good question.
Greater, but there's a certain
Merit to it.
There is a source which says that when a person does it on their own accord, there is something greater about that. How do you reconcile that statement with this statement is a good question.
like,
Because this statement about the one who's not asked gets less reward is not only quoted in this context, it's quoted in other contexts too. Anyway, okay, so it continues. For our sages declare, whoever teaches his daughter Torah is like one who teaches her tales and parables. That's the way he translates tiflus. This applies to the oral law. With regard to the written law, at the outset one should not teach one's daughter. However, if one does, it's not considered as if she was taught idle things. This is Rambam's position. Okay? So now, yeah?
I was going to ask about the intent, but everybody else is asking the same, because that's what I was thinking. If you have the intent to learn something, even if you're not commanded, it should be a greater reward.
Yeah, so in certain, there is a statement like that from the Gemara, but yeah.
So
Okay.
What happens when you're teaching, just to flip the question, you're teaching boys Torah.
Yeah.
Not everybody is brilliant and able to
Yeah.
learn everything.
So for most of it, yeah.
If they're daydreaming and it's like fables and parables, I mean,
Yeah.
what goes on with that?
So
That's
yeah,
tiflus?
yeah.
I mean,
no, but no, because they are obligated.
The truth is,
Obligated, but they don't understand.
the truth is, so there's one thing, is one's obligated to learn,
Right.
one's obligated to teach their sons Torah,
understand that.
right? But beyond that, you're actually correct in the sense that for most of history, if by the time you were 12 years old as a boy,
Okay.
it turned out you weren't the one in the genius in town, you went to go work with your father to be the shoe cobbler or pick tomatoes in the field. Right? Because you learned how to read, you learned how to, on Shabbos afternoon, you'll go to the shir in shul on Shabbos when the rabbi gives a speech. But how many people in every shtetl made it to the yeshiva?
Right.
I don't know how many did. There was the big yeshiva in the center of towns, and they collected all the big boys from all the little villages and hamlets and towns. But I'm not so convinced that every that every boy in all of Jewish history made it to, which is a challenge that we're facing today because we're expecting every single kid to be able to sit in front of a Gemara for 8 hours a day. It's not a very easy thing for the best of the minds. Sorry? Right? It wasn't in the past. So it's a challenge we're facing today beyond the challenge of now girls have to do the same, also sit in front of Gemaras for 8 hours a day. Right? So it goes. Sorry? So when we get to the end and we hear what the Rabbi has to say, maybe they should be, as we'll see.
I learned Gemara.
Okay, there you go. Okay, let's move forward. I want to be able to cover this tonight. Okay, so here we have Piskei Riyaz. It's hard. Okay, so this is his name is Rabbi Shaya ben Elia of Trani. I think I'm pronouncing that word correctly. And you can see on the left there, I put like in bold Riyaz, Rabbi Yeshaya Acharon Zal, the latter. He was. There's two Yeshaya of Tiranis, that one grandson and grandfather and grandson. If you look at the little picture, you can see it there. One's Rid, Rabbi Yeshaya Tirani, and the other one is Riyaz. That's Rabbi Yeshaya Acharon, the latter Yeshaya, both of Tirani. So grandson, grandfather. I'm making this point because the grandfather, who was alive when his grandson was born, they had the same name. He looked at his grandson as like his successor, and this grandfather learned in the Ashkenazi schools. Even though he was in Italy, he learned in the Ashkenazi schools. He learned in the Rhineland, in the same study halls of Rashi. So he came from that tradition. So he writes, I'm translating. Even though a woman is not obligated to study Torah, as the verse reads, you shall teach your sons, and that doesn't include daughters. If one wants to teach their daughter, no problem, you have the right to do so, as explained elsewhere. Now, in the time, this is what you were saying before, in the time when the Saita law was in effect, one is obligated to teach his daughter Torah. So that way, if someone drinks and they get saved, she'll know the background. So he's taking Ben Azai's side.
So this is all related to the Sota?
It's just where the law is derived from. It just happens to be derived. That became the flashpoint for the argument, but not necessarily, right? So he's taking Ben Azai's position, which is that one may / should teach their daughters Torah. So in the times of the Sota, where you have this practical, relevant necessity to teach them Torah, you had to. Now, if you want to, you may. Right? So here's a dispute that goes beyond the Talmudic era. Right? Rambam, which we said before, his years are 1135 to 1204, and the Riyaz, who's 1280 who dies in 1280, so a little bit around the same time, he takes the other position, which says you're allowed to teach your daughter Torah. At least you're allowed, meaning he's taking Ben Azai's position. Now, this distinction to say that Ben Azai is saying, when there's a Sota, you have to teach your daughter's Torah, so that way they know if someone doesn't die, they know why they didn't die, but afterwards you may. It's a very stretched learning of Ben Azai's position, for a very simple reason. If the only reason to teach your daughter Torah is that she knows that a marriage saves someone, then teach your daughter that fact. Just tell your daughter, you should know a marriage can save a woman. That's all. You have to teach them all of Torah. Which kind of gets back to what I was saying earlier, that if you read Ben Azai in the face of it, it's not as if his position is because of the Saita, therefore you should teach your daughters. It's probably more likely, just in general, he felt everybody should be learning Torah because that's what life is. And here's a proof that they should learn Torah. Even though, again, he learns it otherwise. He learns it to say like, oh, then you have to, now you may. But either way, he's still on the Ben Azai side, which says you may teach your daughter Torah with no qualification, with no concern, no worry for what might happen. Right? Okay. A little further down the line, so I mentioned before that the Riyaz is of Ashkenazi tradition, even though he's in Italy. Rambam is in the Sephardic tradition. Here we have another book that comes from the Ashkenazi tradition. You may remember from the last series we did, there was a group in Ashkenaz who were like the ones who brought Kabbalistic thinking into Ashkenaz. They were called the Hasidim of Ashkenaz. They lived an ascetic lifestyle. They were precursors to the Hasidus that we know by hundreds of years. Right? This is in the 12th century, so we're going way back. I just remember this. We spoke about this. They had an influence on a lot of Ashkenazi custom. So one of the big books from that school, known as the Hasidim of Ashkenaz, Chasidei Ashkenaz, is written by one of the leaders of Yehuda HaChasid, and it's called the Sefer HaChasidim, the Book of Hasidim, and it's got a lot of halachas and laws and customs. And he writes, man is obligated to teach his daughters mitzvahs, for example, the halachic rulings of what they have to behave, have to how to live. As for that which it says, that a woman who teaches, someone who teaches a woman Torah, it's as if they're teaching them tiflus, that's only with respect to the background of the law, the depth of the law, the reason for the law, the secrets of the law. Those one doesn't have to teach any women or children. But the laws that they need to know in order to practice, like for example, the laws of Shabbos, you have to teach them. Right? So he is like in the middle. He's taking the position of Rabbi Lezer that there is a tiflus concern, but nonetheless maintains you have to teach them what they need to know, which seems obvious. I'm not sure how Rambam would.
He says very specifically, not the background.
Not the background, which we learned from the Rebbe. He expands it to that, right? But at least there's like this opening that they have to learn the laws that are relevant to their observance. Otherwise, how are they going to do it? So, which is a good question for like Rambam followers. But how did girls know what to do if they didn't learn how to practice? Right? Rambam says you shouldn't teach your daughter Torah. That was his position. No qualifier. Don't teach them. Just don't. Right? So how do they know what to do? So you go to the next text. Another Ashkenazi text, the Maharil, who writes, just want to point out to one line. Here, the second paragraph. If you're concerned that they're not going to know how to perform the mitzvahs, they can be taught verbally, just the principles and the rules. And when they're not sure, they should go ask the rabbi a question. As we've seen, it's done for generations, that women are very well versed in the laws of salting meat and washing meat and removing the sinews that are not kosher. They know the laws of family purity and the like. And all that stuff they learned just by receiving it from their parents without actually ever opening a book. This brings me to a story with my grandmother. You can ask her the story. The first time, I think it was the first time she met the Rebbe with my grandfather. And you heard the story? The Rebbe asked my grandmother, where did you go to school? And my grandmother, this is her words, not mine, I went to the school of Hitler. And that there was no school to which she was during a war. I don't think she told that to the Rebbe, but that's basically what she said. I didn't go to any high school. My education ended at grade 3. So the Rebbe asked her, well, how are you going to know how to run a good Jewish home? So she told the Rebbe, my mother is a good, religious Hungarian lady. I grew up with her, I watched her, and learned from her. And the Rebbe smiled, and the Rebbe said, Abazaya is good, if so, that's good. And this is what the Mariel is referring to here. You're concerned about how women are going to know what to do? They'll learn from their parents, like they've been doing it for the last how many generations? So there's a bit of a divergence here. How you understand Elazar's position. Elazar's position which says, don't teach your daughters Torah, we're getting a few qualifiers. First of all, Rambam says it's not a prohibition against women learning, it's just don't teach your daughters, because they're probably going to misunderstand it. Sefer Hasidim says, well, okay, you can still teach them what they need to know. And Mariel says, no, you don't even have to do that. They'll figure it out from their mothers. Okay, so we're kind of seeing. So the Shulchan Aruch, okay, you'll remember this from our last series. The Shulchan Aruch is divided into two. Rabbi Yosef Cairo, the Sephardic side, and the Ramah, Moshe Isilis, Ashkenazic side. And here's Rabbi Yosef Cairo, who basically verbatim quotes Rambam. You can read it in English. It's there. Woman studies Torah, receives word, but not like the man. It's basically straight out quoting Rambam, which says that don't teach your daughters Torah. And then on the next slide, Rabbi Moshe Isilis says, nevertheless, a woman is obligated to study the laws. A woman is obligated to study the laws that are relevant to her. Right? So you have this Ashkenazi Sephardic split. You have the Ashkenazi more on the liberal side, and the Kabbalists from Ashkenaz, and the Sephardim were more on the conservative side about not teaching daughters Torah. One more on page 13, one more kind of caveat, which says as follows, which highlights what we said earlier, or explicitly states what we said earlier. This is from the Prisha, also an Ashkenazic Halachic authority, student of the Ramah, student of the Ashkenazic Halachic authority that was quoted before from the Shulchan Aruch, who writes, if she herself decides to learn, we can see that she obviously left. She's not part of the majority, which would misunderstand it, and therefore, go ahead and learn. So he explicitly states that which we derive from Rambam, who says a woman can learn, but don't teach her daughters. So he's writing explicitly that if she decides to learn, obviously she's part of the exception. Okay, so what do we have? Just summary. The first opinions were, she shouldn't learn. Well, kind of, but she could, meaning don't teach her, sort of don't teach her because you could teach her the written text, but if she figures it out on her own, that's great. The other opinion, which says, like Ben Azai's opinion, said, yes, you can teach her, but you don't really have to. If Sota is around, then you would have to, right? Then we had the opinion. Then we had that qualify, which said you can teach her the laws relevant to her. With those who said no, because they'll figure it out from their mothers. We had those who said only non-text-based learning, meaning only learning from mother to daughter. And then finally, if she proves to be the exception, then yes, right? So what do we get from all of this? What you get from all of this is two things. The instruction, which says don't teach your daughters Torah, is contingent on the reason. This is very, very important. There are some times when our sages tell us, don't do something. And that becomes an absolute. It's kind of like when the law says you can't drive past 65. The reason for the law is because we need to have safe drivers. The fact that you think you happen to be a safe driver at 85 will not exempt you from the law. It's irrelevant. The reason becomes irrelevant. Once the law is law, it remains law. And that happens a lot in halacha too. There's an instruction that our sages gave us with a certain background or reason, but the reason becomes irrelevant. The law remains law. But here, clearly, it is contingent on the reason, because we have all these exceptions. She can be the outlier. Maybe you can teach her the laws relevant to her, and she's not going to misinterpret that, right? You have all these like qualifiers about when you can go out of it, which means it's not a hard, fast rule, don't. It's subject to, it's contingent on the reason, which means it's subject to the varied circumstances, which would explain why in different places they thought of it differently. I'm assuming, and when we get to the history in the next couple of weeks, we'll see this, that in Ashkenazi countries, they were more liberal with teaching their daughters, so that's how they understood it. In Sephardic countries, they were more conservative about it, that's how they understood it there. Right? So it would have been subject maybe to the circumstances of what women needed to know, and that became the way they understood the law, because the whole law was subject to the reasons of, is it going to cause misunderstanding? And if it's not, she's the exception, go teach her. Which would explain why in history we have women who were involved in Torah scholarship. If it was a hard and fast rule you're not allowed to, they'd never be quoted. And we'll see soon they are quoted. The women scholars are quoted as valid sources. And if it was a hard and fast rule you're not allowed to teach your daughter Torah, then the rabbis would have said, I'm sorry, you're not allowed to. Right? Which means it's obviously one of those rules that are to begin with subject to and contingent to the reason behind it, which explains the Rebbe's thinking. The Rebbe takes the very reason for the law, which was, we're worried women are going to misunderstand it and end up in promiscuity. And the Rebbe says, if you don't teach them, now they're going to get promiscuity and misunderstand it. So the very reason for the law, which says, don't teach your daughters, is why the Rebbe is saying, now you have to teach your daughters, for the same rationale. That was the conversation with the Belzer Rebbe and the Rebbe. Following this, what the Rebbe is kind of telling him. But if you look at the way Tiflis was understood, it was never understood as a hard and fast rule, forbidden. It was subject to the realities of the girls you were talking to. And if this girl was the exception, go teach her. If she's laws that are relevant to her, go teach her. And therefore in today's day and age, where they'll end up with promiscuity if you don't teach them, then you definitely have to teach them. Okay? So here I'm going to read with you a monumental talk in which the Rebbe publicly made this call that women should learn Torah on all levels. It's a free translation provided by yours truly. And it's a little, I think it's a few years after, right? The meeting with the Belzer Rebbe was in 1981. Here the Rebbe is speaking in 1990. So I guess before 1990, the Rebbe was telling this to people maybe in private conversations or in letters, but here the Rebbe makes it a public message. And this talk, unlike many of the Rebbe's talks, which were transcribed but not necessarily edited for publishing by the Rebbe, this talk was. The Rebbe edited it for publishing as an official call to action. So here is my translation. First and foremost, women are obligated to learn those laws relevant to their mitzvah observance. Right? We saw these quotes earlier, which is a huge amount of Torah law. If only men were proficient in all this, laws of Shabbos, kosher, all the prohibitions, the laws of family purity. So that's first of all. So there's plenty to teach them, number one. Additionally, the quote he's giving here is actually from the Alter Rebbe. Okay. Additionally, and more importantly, learning the inner dimension of Torah, Chassidus, in which it is explained the concepts of faith, God's unity, love, and awe of Him. Women are obligated just as men. If a woman is obligated to learn that which is relevant to her observance, and she's obligated to love God and fear God, then she has to learn those sections of Torah relevant to loving and fearing God. So you have to learn Chassidus. Again, very novel. I mean, I don't have to tell you what this means, that a Hasidic Rebbe is telling his followers, your wives have to go learn Hasidus. This wasn't the message that they heard 100 years earlier or 60 years earlier. Okay, continuing, we might add to this, even regarding those parts of Torah that are not relevant to their observance, and all of Torah learning, broadly speaking. A woman who learns Torah, including those sections that aren't relevant to her observance, receives reward. And she must recite the blessing of Torah before that study. Right? They were citing to that Rambam. Rambam said that you shouldn't teach your daughters Torah. He was taking that hardline position. But he began by saying a woman who learns Torah receives reward. So don't tell me it's forbidden. Maybe you'll tell me you shouldn't teach your daughters, but women should be learning. She gets reward. Maybe not as great as a reward, but she should. In fact, the Rabbi adds here, before she learns, she would have to make a bracha over learning Torah. Before we do any mitzvah, we make a bracha on the mitzvah. Right? Before we light Shabbos candles, before we put on tefillin, before we do anything, we make a bracha. We also make a bracha before we learn Torah. It's part of the morning blessings, the very last one. Baruch atah Hashem nosen Torah. That's the blessing we make for thanking Hashem for the Torah and for the mitzvah of learning Torah. So if a woman wants to learn Torah, she'd have to make that bracha before, indicating that it's a real obligation. Continues the Rebbe, and here's the tense part. Back to that conversation with the Belzer Rebbe. As for that which our sages instructed that one should not teach his daughter Torah, etc., and other such statements. Firstly, we find throughout history many righteous women who were proficient Torah scholars, beginning in the times of the Mishnah and in the generations that followed. So obviously it wasn't a hard and fast rule, because we know women who learned. And the Rebbe throws this in here, which is very nice. This was indeed the spirit in which my father-in-law, the Rebbe, educated his daughters. He's talking about his own wife. But he's telling everybody, you should just know, my wife was educated in Torah by her father, who was the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. So if you want precedent for teaching your daughters Torah, my father-in-law and my wife, there's your precedent. I should note that this is 3 years after his wife passed away. I don't know that the Rebbe ever spoke about his wife before she passed away. To the best of my knowledge, she never did. But here the Rebbe makes this reference that my wife and her sisters were taught by their father Torah. The Rebbe continues, most importantly, in the last few generations, it has become common practice for all Jewish women, such that, by way of illustration, in generations bygone, there were no educational institutions for girls. They were educated by the traditions they observed at home, each daughter from a mother and grandmother. Nevertheless, in the last few generations, the greatest Jewish leaders have established educational institutions for girls, Beis Yaakov, Beis Malka, all the schools we talked about earlier. And the reason why they did this is seeing as this was an imperative of the times, considering that girls would be, in any event, highly influenced by their surroundings outside the home, such that it became crucial to establish educational institutions for girls so that they can receive a proper, wholesome, and kosher education. Right? That was kind of saying, you, Torah establishment, have already changed your view on how you talk to girls. He's not talking about Chabad schools here. He's talking about Orthodox schools in general. Orthodox leadership, who might be pushing back at me for saying that women should learn, you guys have already changed your tune on how you talk to girls. Girls never had institutions of learning, and today all of you do. Why did you do it? Because you know that they used to be only influenced by the home, and now they're not being influenced by the home. Okay, so you're teaching them. Maybe they aren't teaching them the depth that I'm asking for. You're teaching them just the relevant laws, maybe, right? Which could be what they're teaching in Beis Malka, I have no idea. But I would assume that that's what they're teaching. They're teaching the basic laws that they need to know, which is much less than what I'm asking for, but it's still a far cry from what you used to do 100 years ago. You've changed your tune there. If that's the case, says the Rebbe, time to change your tune on women in large. And that's the next lines. So it is with all Torah learning, beyond the laws relevant to their observance, considering that women will inevitably engage in all kinds of study through which she will gain cunning. He's quoting that Rashi, which says, Tiflos is to teach a girl cunning. You don't want to do that. They were saying they're going to get that anyway. It is therefore not only permissible for women to study Torah, but moreover, considering the very reason for the original ban, they must be taught all of Torah. You're not teaching them because you didn't want them to become promiscuous. Now, if you don't teach them, then they'll be promiscuous. So get teaching them. And not only the dry letter of the law, but include the reasons behind the law, with all the scholarly analysis that goes into it. As this is human nature for both men and women, that they enjoy and take greater delight in such kind of learning, such that their abilities and mind be developed in the spirit of our holy Torah, rather than be developed by the street, is basically what they're saying. Finally, the following should be noted. This positive innovation in the latter generations, though it would seem that this is the result of a generational decline, meaning we used to live in this beautiful cocoon where we didn't have to deal with the issues of the fact that women were hanging out in the streets. So it seems like it's a negative thing that we're kind of, well, we have no choice, we have to start teaching women Torah. That's what you would think. The net result, for whatever reason, says the Rebbe, is a good one, since it has brought an increase in Torah study. We might suggest, the Rebbe concludes, that the reason we in these latter generations have merited to women studying Torah is because, as we near the end of exile, we highlight our preparation for redemption when knowledge and wisdom will be increased. And the footnote the Rebbe adds that Mashiach is a feminine experience, and therefore it's appropriate that before Mashiach comes, women learn Torah. And this is, if I remember correctly, that makes reference to the Women Convention that comes right after this, and encourages the Women Convention to promote learning amongst women. So this kind of gives us a theoretical overview of the history of how women were understood in Torah learning. So we're getting, I hope, two things here, or three things, let's say. Number one, to appreciate when we do meet these women who studied and learned Torah scholarship throughout the history, understand how big of a deal it was for them. They were like literally in a man's world, some of them, as we'll see, very strongly. It's number one, to appreciate the fact that they actually decided to learn. Number two, to appreciate that simultaneously it isn't a break from traditional norms, in the sense that if a careful reading of the original texts indicate that it isn't a hard, fast ban so much as a circumstantial issue, what's going to be the result of this learning? And if the results prove to be good, then go ahead. Which leads to point number three, the Rebbe's radical approach that simultaneously maintains the traditional text but completely breaks from it. Breaks from tradition where women were not encouraged to learn, but still maintains a really thorough and deep reading of the original text, which says, avoid promiscuity by not teaching them, to which the Rebbe says, avoid promiscuity by teaching them Torah. So there's that, and God willing, next week we'll start getting into some of the personalities throughout our history who have indeed done this and broke the mold, as it were, and learned Torah, even though it might have been tiflis.